Ukraine just turned a nearly 900-meter Russian fuel train into a burning blockade across Russia's own military supply route. The entire train weighed close to 2,800 tons and was carrying fuel and military cargo. Minutes later, the locomotive was dead. Fuel was burning across the ballast beneath the cars. Secondary blasts were cracking through the smoke, and Russian supply traffic behind the train had come to a dead stop. But here is the part that makes the strike remarkable. The bridge was still standing, and Russia's air defenses were still fighting. Ukraine had not needed to destroy the bridge or wipe out the defenses around it. Instead, it found a way to make Russia's own train shut down the route behind it. So, how do you trap a nearly 2,800-ton military train without first destroying the bridge beneath it? The answer begins 14.6 kilometers before the crossing. At 4:23 a.m. outside Luhansk, a Russian military supply train was holding 63 kilometers per hour on a railway line, roughly 112 kilometers behind the fighting. The locomotive was pulling 61 cars, almost 900 meters of fuel and military cargo, toward a bridge 14.6 kilometers ahead. From the cab, the war still felt distant. No artillery flashes, no explosions along the track, just diesel vibration, steel wheels, and an open line disappearing into the darkness. A train could move enormous weight in one trip, but it had almost no freedom once something went wrong. A road convoy could split or turn away. This train had almost no room to maneuver. It could keep moving forward or reverse, and both depended on the locomotive still producing power and the rails beneath nearly 2,800 tons remaining intact. Then a warning reached the locomotive from farther up the route. Possible Ukrainian drones approaching the railway corridor. From the cab, the warning had no visible source yet. No explosion ahead, no lights moving against the sky. The bridge was still open, and at 63 kilometers per hour, the train kept taking another 17 meters of track every second. Stopping would remove that speed, but it would also leave almost a kilometer of fuel and military cargo sitting exposed in open country. So the crew kept the locomotive moving while the warning was checked. Several kilometers ahead, a Russian Kosta 2E2 radar was already doing exactly that. Low returns began appearing against the ground clutter, disappearing, then returning farther along the same approach. Within seconds, the warning changed from possibility to threat. Several Ukrainian UAVs were already closing on the railway line ahead of the train. The Kosta 2E2 warning went straight to the nearest Tor-M2. 6 low contacts were moving toward the railway corridor, but the radar picture was not clean. Tree lines and the raised rail embankment repeatedly cut into the returns. One contact faded, reappeared farther along the same bearing, then held long enough for the Tor crew to engage. Its radar turned onto the target, the launcher followed, and a missile left the vehicle in a hard flash. Seconds later, the first UJ-26 Beaver disappeared from the air picture. The Tor immediately shifted toward another contact as a nearby Pantsir-S1 rotated onto a UAV, approaching from a different angle. It locked, fired, and removed a second Beaver before it reached the railway line. At the same time, Pole 21 was pushing interference across the navigation bands around the crossing. A third contact began drifting away from the course it had been holding. For the Russian side, those were real successes. The defense was making the attack pay for every kilometer, but so was the train. At 4:28 a.m., the locomotive was roughly 9 kilometers from the bridge, still holding 63 kilometers per hour and taking another 17 meters of railway every second. Beyond the locomotive headlights, the line ahead remained open. Nothing had struck the train, nothing had damaged the crossing. Railway command had only minutes to choose. Stop almost 900 meters of fuel and military cargo in open country, or keep moving toward a bridge already covered by Kosta, Tor, and Pantsir. At that moment, continuing forward carried the smaller risk. The order was simple: keep moving and clear the crossing. The locomotive held speed. Tor shifted again. Pantsir continued scanning. Another return disappeared from the radar picture. For the next minute, the decision looked right. But while Russian air defense was removing threats from the sky, the train was using up something it could not recover as easily: distance. Every kilometer forward left less railway between the locomotive and the bridge, and fewer options if something changed ahead. From that point on, the crossing was only getting closer. At 6.8 kilometers, the train was still holding speed. Another low contact entered the Tor-M2 engagement sector, and the battery turned toward it while the railway remained open. At 481 kilometers, the Pantsir-S1 was still scanning the approaches. Nothing had struck the bridge. Nothing had stopped the train. From the Russian side, continuing forward still looked like the right call. At 2.3 kilometers, however, the problem was no longer only the drones. It was where the train was about to go. The bridge ahead compressed the railway into a single narrow crossing. Almost 900 meters of train still had to pass through it, and Ukraine had still made no direct attempt to stop the consist. At 4:37 a.m., the locomotive began rolling onto the bridge. The first cars followed, while the middle of the train continued advancing toward the span, and hundreds of meters of the rear consist kept pushing forward behind them. 30 seconds earlier, the locomotive had still been approaching the bridge with open track in front of it. Now, its front end was already on the crossing, while hundreds of meters of cargo continued feeding forward behind it. If traction failed here, or if the rail became unusable, the train could no longer simply clear the bridge and deal with the problem somewhere else. The train itself could become the obstacle blocking the route. The train was committed. Almost immediately, Costa 2E2 began showing additional contacts arriving from another sector. The Russian air picture was no longer concentrated along a single approach. It was widening just as the train's room to maneuver was shrinking. Ukraine still had not gone for the cargo. First, it was going to take away the one thing the train still had: movement. The new contacts did not converge on one point. As the Costa 2E2 picture widened, the surviving UJ-26 beavers split toward different parts of the railway. The first attack went for the locomotive. A Tor-M2 picked up one beaver descending toward the front of the train and fired. The missile caught it before the final run. A second UAV stayed lower, crossed the rail embankment at the last moment, and struck low against the locomotive's power section. Less than a minute after the locomotive entered the crossing, it lost power. It was not blown apart, and it did not need to be. Traction collapsed, and the engine could no longer keep pulling nearly 900 meters of train across the bridge. Almost at the same time, another beaver came down near the rear approach. The blast threw ballast and damaged sleepers across the railway, making a quick reverse increasingly risky. A third beaver came in over the river and struck beside a rail joint on the crossing. The span stayed up, but the track above it was no longer something the crew could safely trust, under thousands of tons of moving weight. Russian defenses were still fighting. Pantsir-S1 continued tracking low targets. Tor shifted again. Pole 21 was still degrading navigation, and not every beaver held a clean line. But the battle had changed. Air defense was still trying to remove threats from the sky, while Ukraine was removing choices from the railway below. Inside the consist, speed began to fall. The locomotive slowed first, while hundreds of meters of loaded cars behind it were still carrying their momentum forward. Compression moved through the couplers. Brake pressure followed through the consist, and the tankers rocked as the train settled onto the crossing. The speed kept dropping. Then it reached zero. The train had survived the first hits. That was not the same as escaping them. It had stopped in the worst possible place. The train had stopped, but the fight around it had not. Russian personnel were already moving along the ballast toward the damaged locomotive as smoke gathered around the front of the consist. Radio traffic increased along a train that now stretched for almost 900 meters across the crossing. One guard looked up and caught a UJ-26 beaver coming in low. The range was roughly 520 meters. At close to 170 kilometers per hour, that left about 11 seconds before the drone reached the train. He raised his AK-12. 11 seconds to see the target, judge its direction, lead it, and put enough rounds into something small moving through darkness at nearly 47 meters per second. Then the view widened. A Pantsir-S1 was still tracking targets, but the engagement picture had become more complicated. The stationary train, bridge structure, and Russian personnel now occupied the same space the drones were approaching through. The system could still engage, but the defensive problem was no longer as clean as it had been over open ground. The Tor-M2 remained active too, but the defensive problem had expanded. Russian crews were now trying to cover a stationary target almost 900 meters long against drones arriving from more than one direction. Pole 21 was still degrading satellite navigation, but that no longer guaranteed a kill. A beaver that lost GNSS could continue on internal navigation. The guard fired. Rounds climbed into the darkness. The beaver kept coming. Pantsir turned toward another contact. Tor shifted again. Then the drone passed the damaged locomotive without diving. That changed the target problem again. Ukraine no longer needed to stop the train. That problem had already been solved. The beaver adjusted toward the tanker section. The beaver that had passed the locomotive stayed low and continued along the length of the train. There was no reason to spend another warhead on the engine. By now, the locomotive had lost power, the rear approach had been damaged, and the crossing itself could no longer be treated as a clear route. The first hits had removed movement. Now the train's cargo had become the vulnerability. At 4:41 a.m., the drone turned toward one of the tanker cars near the middle of the consist and struck. The impact ruptured the tank. Fuel spilled into the ballast beneath the cars, and the fire followed it along the track bed. Flames spread outward from the point of impact, while smoke began rolling across the crossing. A single rail tanker could hold tens of thousands of liters, and Ukraine did not need every tanker in the fuel section to burn. Breaching even part of that section was enough to create sustained fire, heat, heavy smoke, and a serious access problem around the damaged train. The beaver had brought the explosive charge. The train had brought far more combustible material to the battlefield itself. The fire was already spreading beyond the tanker. Heat reached adjacent cars and track hardware. Smoke covered parts of the crossing and made the damaged section harder to approach. Another beaver came through the same battle space and struck a covered military wagon farther back in the consist. The impact opened the car. Short secondary bursts cracked through the smoke, separated by seconds rather than one single explosion. Russian air defense was still active. Tor-M2 was still shifting. Pantsir-S1 was still tracking. Pol-21 was still interfering. But the fight had changed. Shooting down the remaining drones was no longer enough if the burning train itself kept the crossing out of service. Within minutes, the bridge was still standing, but the train remained across it. Damaged track lay beneath and behind the consist, and normal rail traffic could no longer pass. The bridge was still there. The railway across it was not functioning. By sunrise, smoke was still hanging over the crossing, and the damaged train was still occupying the line. Russian air defense had not simply collapsed. Kasta-2E2 had detected the threat. Tor-M2 and Pantsir-S1 had engaged it, and Pol-21 had complicated navigation. None of those systems needed to fail completely for the railway operation itself to fail. The decisive change had happened earlier, when keeping the train moving still looked like the safer choice. A moving target approached a narrow crossing. The locomotive entered the bridge. The rest of the consist followed. Then traction disappeared, the train stopped, and its own fuel turned the immobilized consist into a much larger problem. Ukraine did not need Russia to make a bad decision. It needed Russia to make a predictable one. The bridge itself was not the trap. Commitment was. A military railway does not have to collapse into a river to lose its value. If a damaged train has to be recovered, rails inspected, the bridge checked for structural damage, and traffic held until the route is declared safe, the logistics clock has already been reset. Fuel, ammunition, and other military cargo begin arriving later than planned. The defenses were still operating, but the fuel train was no longer moving, and neither was the supply traffic behind it. If you were commanding that route, would you have stopped the train in the open or kept it moving toward the bridge? Tell me what you would have done in the comments, and subscribe for more battlefield analysis like this.